The entire town gathered to watch her fail. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the edge of the corral, facing a beast that had already sent 3 men to the doctor and 1 to his grave. They weren't here to help, they came to laugh. At 39, unmarried, unwanted, she'd become Dry Creek's favorite joke. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything this frontier town believed about strength, about worth, about who deserved to stand tall when the dust settled. This is her story. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Eleanor's journey travels. The wind off the Medicine Bow Range cut through Dry Creek like a blade through butter, and Eleanor Whitmore pulled her threadbare coat tighter as she walked past the Miller's General Store. February 1887 had been merciless. The kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your fingers go numb even through 2 pairs of gloves she didn't own. She'd stopped wearing gloves 3 winters ago. Couldn't afford them on a schoolteacher's salary, not after her father's debts had eaten through what little inheritance her mother left behind. "Poor thing," she heard Martha Henderson whisper to her daughter as Eleanor passed. Not quiet enough. Never quiet enough. 39 years old and still alone. My George says it's unnatural. Eleanor kept walking. 16 years in this town, and she'd learned that responding only made it worse. They wanted her to react, to prove she cared what they thought. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The schoolhouse sat at the eastern edge of town, a simple clapboard building that leaked when it rained and froze solid when the temperature dropped below 20. Eleanor had been teaching there since she was 23, when her father's gambling had destroyed any chance of a better life elsewhere. Boston felt like a dream now, something that had happened to a different woman. She pushed open the door, and the familiar smell of chalk dust and wood smoke greeted her. At least here, in this drafty room, with its crooked desks and cracked blackboard, she had purpose. The children didn't mock her. Well, not to her face. "Miss Whitmore!" Little Sarah Chen rushed forward, her black braids bouncing. "Tommy said his pa's got a horse that's going to kill somebody. Is that true?" Eleanor set her books down carefully. "Tommy's father has a difficult animal. That doesn't mean—" "My daddy says only a fool would go near that devil horse," interrupted James Patterson, 8 years old and already carrying his father's swagger. "Says Mr. Mercer's going to lose everything because he can't break it." "Mr. Mercer's business is his own, James." Eleanor moved to the blackboard, picking up the chalk. "Now, who can tell me what we learned yesterday about fractions?" But her mind wasn't on mathematics. Caleb Mercer. She'd seen him exactly 3 times in town. A young man, maybe 26 or 27, with the kind of raw-boned handsomeness that made women forget how to speak in complete sentences. He'd inherited his father's ranch 2 years ago and promptly made a mess of things. Or so the gossip went. Not that Eleanor paid attention to gossip, except she did, because what else was there? In a town of 243 souls, gossip was currency, entertainment, and social structure all rolled into one. The morning passed slowly. Eleanor taught reading, writing, basic arithmetic. She broke up a fight between the Patterson boy and young Michael O'Brien over whose father could spit farther. She helped little Emma Rodriguez sound out the word Massachusetts for the 4th time that week. When the children finally tumbled out for lunch, Eleanor sat at her desk and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of stillness. 5 minutes to not be strong, not be composed, not be the woman who pretended whispers didn't cut like glass. "Miss Whitmore?" She looked up. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, small hands twisted in her apron. "Shouldn't you be eating lunch, Sarah?" "I brought extra." The girl held out a cloth bundle. "Mama made too many dumplings. She said you probably don't eat enough." Eleanor's throat tightened. Mary Chen understood what it meant to be an outsider in Dry Creek. Her family had come from San Francisco 5 years ago, following the railroad work, and stayed when Mary's husband found employment at the mill. They'd faced their own share of whispers, their own cold shoulders. "Thank you, Sarah. Tell your mother I said thank you very much." The girl beamed and ran back outside. Eleanor unwrapped the bundles slowly, the scent of pork and ginger making her mouth water. When had she last eaten something this good? She couldn't remember. She was halfway through her 2nd dumpling when the shouting started. Eleanor reached the window in time to see half the town streaming toward the western edge of Dry Creek, where Caleb Mercer's ranch began. Something had happened, something big enough to pull people away from their midday meals. She shouldn't go. She should stay here, mind her own business, avoid whatever spectacle was drawing the crowd. She went anyway. By the time Eleanor reached the corral, at least 50 people had gathered, forming a loose circle around the fence. Inside the enclosure, a massive black stallion wheeled and screamed, hooves flashing, while 3 men struggled to control a rope attached to his halter. "Let him go!" someone shouted. "He's going to kill you!" Eleanor pushed through the crowd until she could see clearly. The horse was magnificent, probably 16 hands, pure black except for a white star between his eyes. But his eyes showed the whites, and foam flecked his mouth. This wasn't aggression. This was terror. "Step back." Caleb Mercer stood outside the corral, his face pale. "Everyone back!" But the crowd pressed closer, drawn by the promise of violence, of entertainment, of something to talk about for weeks to come. The stallion reared, and one of the men lost his grip on the rope. The horse lunged forward, teeth bared, and the other 2 men scrambled backward, one of them tripping and falling hard. The crowd gasped, delighted. "Somebody's gonna die," Martha Henderson said, not quite quietly enough. "Mark my words." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the fence rail. The horse wasn't trying to kill anyone. He was trying to escape. Every movement, every scream was pure panic, and these fools were making it worse, pushing him further into blind terror. "Mr. Mercer!" A man in an expensive suit emerged from the crowd, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud. "I've seen enough. This animal is unmanageable. Our agreement... I can handle him," Caleb interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just need more time." "You've had 3 months." The suited man pulled out a pocket watch, consulting it with exaggerated care. 3 months and 4 injured men, one of whom, I remind you, has a broken collarbone and cannot work. "I'll pay his wages until... This isn't about wages, Mr. Mercer. It's about competence." The man's voice carried across the crowd, and Eleanor realized with sick certainty that this was deliberate. This was theater. "You represented yourself as an experienced horseman capable of training difficult animals. This beast proves otherwise." Caleb's jaw clenched. "My father trained horses for 20 years. I know what I'm doing. Your father is dead and you are not him." The words landed like a slap. "I invested $15,000 in your ranch based on your assurances. If you cannot deliver what you promised, I will deliver." But Caleb's hands shook slightly, and Eleanor saw what everyone else must see. A young man drowning, grasping at straws, watching his entire future circle the drain. The suited man smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Then prove it. Break this horse in the next 2 weeks, or I will exercise the forfeiture clause in our contract. Your ranch becomes mine." The crowd murmured. $15,000. That was more money than most people in Dry Creek would see in a lifetime. And Caleb Mercer was going to lose it all because of one terrified horse. 2 weeks, Caleb said quietly. "I understand." "Excellent." The suited man, Eleanor thought someone had called him Mr. Pemberton, glanced around at the assembled crowd. His gaze landed on Eleanor, and something ugly flickered in his expression. "Of course, there are other ways to make our arrangement appear more stable, more respectable." "What do you mean?" Pemberton gestured vaguely toward Eleanor. "A married man presents better to investors, more settled, more trustworthy." He paused, his smile widening. "I'm sure Miss Whitmore would be grateful for the opportunity. A woman her age, still unwed, well, beggars cannot be choosers, as they say." The laughter started immediately. Not everyone. Mary Chen didn't laugh, and old Tom Morrison looked uncomfortable. But enough. Enough to make Eleanor's face burn. Enough to make her stomach twist. Caleb stared at Pemberton. You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm quite serious. Though perhaps Miss Whitmore has higher standards than I credit her with." More laughter. Pemberton was enjoying this, feeding off the crowd's reaction like a performer on a stage. "Still, it would solve multiple problems at once. You'd have a wife to demonstrate stability, and she'd have..." He gestured at Eleanor's worn coat, her patched dress. "Well, a roof over her head at least." Eleanor felt the words forming in her throat, sharp words, cutting words, the kind that would put this preening peacock in his place. But she'd learned long ago that defending yourself only proved you'd been wounded. Instead, she turned and walked away, head high, back straight, giving them nothing. Behind her, the laughter continued. Someone made a joke she didn't quite catch. Someone else responded. The entertainment continued. She made it halfway back to the schoolhouse before her composure cracked. Not tears, she was too angry for tears, but her hands shook, and her breath came in short gasps. 39 years old, unwanted, grateful for any opportunity, even one offered as a joke. "Miss Whitmore, wait!" She turned. Caleb Mercer jogged toward her, his face flushed. Up close, he looked even younger than she'd thought. Maybe 25. God, she was old enough to be his, well, not his mother, but certainly his aunt. "I'm sorry," he said, slightly out of breath. "What Pemberton said, it was inexcusable." "Yes, it was." Eleanor kept her voice level. "Is there something you need, Mr. Mercer?" "I wanted to apologize. I should have said something. Should have what? Defended the old spinster's honor?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "I don't need defending. I need to get back to my students." She started to turn away, but Caleb caught her arm. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face, and he immediately released her. "I'm sorry," he said again. I wanted you to know I didn't think it was funny," what he said. "How magnanimous of you." Eleanor adjusted her coat. "Good luck with your horse, Mr. Mercer." This time, he let her go. That evening, Eleanor sat in her small room above the bakery and tried to focus on correcting arithmetic assignments. The numbers swam before her eyes. 7 times 8, 9 times 6. Simple problems with simple answers, unlike everything else in her life. She'd rented this room for 12 years, ever since her father's death had made staying in the family house impossible. The house had been sold to pay debts, and Eleanor had moved here with 3 dresses, a dozen books, and the sharp understanding that she would die in this town, alone, unmourned, except perhaps by a handful of students who would quickly forget her face. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral into self-pity. "Eleanor?" Mary Chen's voice, soft and worried. "May I come in?" Eleanor opened the door. Mary stood there with a basket covered in cloth, her expression gentle. "I brought dinner. Thought you might not feel like cooking." "I never feel like cooking. I'm terrible at it." Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in?" Mary settled into the room's only chair while Eleanor sat on the bed. They'd formed an unlikely friendship over the years, 2 outsiders who understood what it meant to be always watched, always judged. "What Pemberton said today was cruel," Mary began, but Eleanor cut her off. "It was true. I am 39 and unmarried. I do wear patched dresses. I probably would be grateful for a roof over my head if I lost this room." "That doesn't make it right to mock you publicly," Eleanor sighed. "No, but since when has Dry Creek cared about right?" They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind rattled the window, and Eleanor could hear the bakery ovens humming below. "You know horses," Mary said finally. "I've seen you with them. That day when the Pattersons' mare got spooked, you calmed her in minutes." "That was different. That was just, you have a gift, Eleanor. Everyone knows it, even if they won't admit it." Mary leaned forward. "That stallion today. He wasn't vicious. He was scared." "I know." Eleanor had been thinking about it all evening, unable to shake the image of those rolling eyes, that foam-flecked mouth. "But it's not my business. Mercer will figure it out or he won't. And if he doesn't, Pemberton takes the ranch and Caleb loses everything his father built." Mary paused. "I know you don't owe him anything. I know what he let happen today was wrong. But what? But maybe this isn't about him. Maybe it's about proving that you can do something none of those laughing men could manage." Eleanor looked at her friend. "That sounds like pride talking." "Maybe. Or maybe it sounds like someone who's tired of watching you accept what this town thinks you deserve." Mary stood, gathering her basket. "Just think about it. That's all I ask." After Mary left, Eleanor tried to return to the arithmetic assignments, but her mind kept drifting back to the corral. To the black stallion, magnificent and terrified. To Caleb Mercer's shaking hands. To Pemberton's cruel smile. She could help. She knew she could. But helping meant exposing herself to more mockery, more whispers, more proof that the desperate old spinster would do anything for male attention. Eleanor set down her pen and walked to the window. Outside, Dry Creek settled into its evening routine. Lanterns flickered in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere, a dog barked. This town had taken almost everything from her: her youth, her dreams, her father's house, her dignity, piece by piece, year after year. But it hadn't taken her skill with horses. That, at least, remained hers. 3 days passed. Eleanor taught her students, corrected their work, broke up their fights, wiped their noses. She listened to the gossip that filtered through the classroom like smoke. Caleb Mercer had hired another trainer from Laramie, and the man had lasted exactly 45 minutes before the stallion sent him running. Pemberton was in town, staying at the hotel, making it clear he expected to own the Mercer ranch by month's end. On the 4th day, Eleanor made her decision. She waited until well after midnight, when Dry Creek slept and the moon hung fat and silver over the snow. She dressed in her oldest clothes, wrapped herself in her father's ancient coat, and walked the half-mile to Mercer's ranch. The corral stood empty under the moonlight. The stallion had been moved to a smaller paddock behind the barn, away from the main house. Eleanor could hear him moving restlessly, hooves striking frozen ground. She approached slowly, making no effort to hide her footsteps. Let him hear her coming. Let him know she meant no harm. The stallion's head came up sharply when she reached the fence. In the moonlight, his coat looked like polished obsidian. Beautiful and deadly, if you believed the stories. Eleanor believed in fear instead. "Hello, boy," she said softly. Not too soft. Horses could hear uncertainty, but calm, steady. "Nobody here but us." The stallion snorted, backing away from the fence. His ears swiveled, tracking her every movement. Eleanor didn't climb the fence, didn't reach out, didn't do any of the things that would mark her as a threat. She simply stood there, breathing evenly, letting him see that she carried no rope, no whip, no instrument of control. "They don't understand you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They see aggression, but I see something else. I see what they did to make you this way." The stallion's ears flicked forward, listening now, not just reacting. Someone hurt you. Someone broke your trust. Eleanor knew that feeling intimately. And now everyone expects you to perform, to submit, to be something you're not. But submission isn't the same as trust, is it? She stayed there for an hour, maybe longer, just talking. Not training, not demanding, just offering her presence like a gift he could accept or refuse. When she finally turned to leave, the stallion took 3 steps toward the fence, not close enough to touch, but closer than he'd been. Progress. "Miss Whitmore!" Eleanor spun around. Caleb Mercer stood near the barn, wrapped in a heavy coat, his expression unreadable. "I didn't hear you," she said, and hated how defensive she sounded. "I saw someone walking past the house. Thought it might be trouble." He moved closer, keeping his distance from the paddock. "You're good with him." "I haven't done anything yet." "You got him to approach the fence. That's more than anyone else has managed." Caleb rubbed his face. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong. My father could gentle any horse, but this one—" "Your father didn't use force?" "Never. He said force broke a horse's body, but not its spirit. Said a broken spirit was worse than useless." Caleb's voice cracked slightly. "I've tried everything he taught me. Nothing works." Eleanor studied him in the moonlight. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes, shoulders slumped with defeat. Young, yes. Handsome, certainly, but also drowning, same as she'd seen at the corral. "What did you name him?" Caleb blinked. "The horse? I didn't. Seemed wrong to name something I was going to sell." "You can't work with something nameless. It makes him an object instead of—" She trailed off. "Never mind, it's not my business." "Wait." Caleb took a step toward her. "You could help, couldn't you? I've seen you with the school children's ponies, the way they respond to you. If you could—" "No. I'd pay you. Whatever you—" I said no. Eleanor's voice came out harder than intended. "I'm not interested in becoming the town's next source of entertainment. The desperate spinster helping the handsome young rancher? They'd love that story." Caleb flinched. "That's not what I meant." "It doesn't matter what you meant. It's what they'd say." Eleanor started walking toward the road. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." "Please." The words stopped her. "I'm going to lose everything. The ranch, my father's legacy, all of it. I don't care what people say. I need help." Eleanor turned back slowly. "You should care what people say. You live here. You have to face them every day." "So do you." Yes, and I've had 16 years to learn how to survive it. She met his eyes. You haven't. They stood there in the frozen night, two people on opposite sides of an invisible line. Finally, Caleb spoke again. What would you need? To help. I mean, what would it take? Eleanor considered. What did she need? Respect, certainly. Privacy. Protection from the mockery she knew would come. Conditions, she said finally. No one can know I'm helping. No one. You take credit for any progress with the horse. I work here at night, when the town's asleep. But that's... People should know what you're... Those are my conditions, Mr. Mercer. Accept them or find someone else. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, then... Accepted. When can you start? Tomorrow night. And Mr. Mercer? Eleanor pulled her coat tighter. Don't expect miracles. I can't promise anything except that I'll try. That's more than I have now. Eleanor walked home through the snow, her mind already working through approaches, techniques, the slow, careful process of rebuilding trust with a creature that had every reason to believe trust was a lie. She didn't let herself think about what would happen if she failed. Didn't let herself imagine the satisfaction on Pemberton's face, or the whispers that would follow. Didn't let herself wonder why she was doing this at all. Sometimes you helped because you could, because no one else would, because somewhere deep down, beneath all the armor and anger and resignation, you still believed that good work mattered, even if no one ever knew you'd done it. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, secret rhythm. Eleanor taught her students during the day, graded papers in the evening, then slipped out into the frozen night to work with the stallion she'd decided to call Midnight, though she never told Caleb the name. Progress came slowly. The first 3 nights, she simply stood by the fence, talking, letting him grow accustomed to her presence. On the 4th night, he let her touch his nose through the rails, just briefly, just a second, before jerking away. On the 7th night, she entered the paddock. Caleb watched from a safe distance, his face pale with worry, but Eleanor had made him promise not to interfere. Inside the enclosure, she felt her heartbeat steady and slow. This was where she belonged, not in a classroom, not in a rented room above a bakery, but here, with an animal that saw her as she truly was. Midnight backed away when she approached, but he didn't charge, didn't scream, just watched her with those intelligent, wary eyes. I know, Eleanor said softly. I know what it feels like when everyone expects you to be something you're not. When they push and push until you want to lash out, just to make them stop. She moved in a wide circle, never approaching directly, never pushing into his space, just being there, present but not threatening. But lashing out doesn't help, does it? It just proves what they already think, that you're dangerous, unpredictable, not worth the effort. Midnight's ears swiveled toward her voice. So we pretend. We build walls. We show them only what they expect to see. Eleanor stopped moving, standing still in the center of the paddock. But walls keep everything out, even the things that might actually help. The stallion took a step toward her, then another. Eleanor held her breath, forcing herself to remain motionless. If she reached out now, she'd break the spell. This had to be his choice. Midnight approached slowly, neck stretched out, nostrils flaring. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, so close she could see her reflection in his dark eyes. That's it, she whispered. Your choice. Always your choice. The horse took one more step, and his nose brushed her outstretched hand. From the fence, she heard Caleb's sharp intake of breath, but Eleanor didn't look away from Midnight. She stood perfectly still as the stallion explored her palm, her wrist, the sleeve of her coat, letting him learn her scent, her stillness, her lack of threat. When he finally stepped back, Eleanor released her breath slowly. Good boy, she said quietly. That's enough for tonight. She left the paddock without turning her back, maintaining eye contact until she reached the gate. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge Caleb. That was incredible, he said, his voice rough. How did you... Time. Patience. Letting him come to me instead of forcing myself on him. Eleanor brushed hay off her coat. Tomorrow night I'll bring a halter. No rope yet. Just let him get used to the weight. Should I try working with him during the day, using your methods? Eleanor hesitated. You can try, but don't push. If he resists, step back. The worst thing you can do now is undo the progress we've made. Caleb nodded, looking toward the paddock where Midnight stood watching them. Why are you doing this, Miss Whitmore? Really? She'd asked herself the same question a dozen times. Because I can. Because he deserves better than what he's gotten. Because, she trailed off. Because maybe proving them all wrong matters more than I want to admit. The truth was simpler and more complicated than that. Eleanor worked with Midnight because for the first time in 16 years, someone needed what only she could provide. Not her polite classroom manners or her ability to stretch a dollar until it screamed. Her actual skill. The thing she was genuinely good at. That realization carried her through the next week of frozen midnight sessions, through the gossip she overheard at Miller's General Store about Caleb's miraculous improvement with the stallion, through Martha Henderson's pointed comment that some men had natural gifts with animals while others, she'd glanced meaningfully at Eleanor, were better suited to simpler tasks. Eleanor had smiled and purchased her flour and said nothing. By the end of the second week, Midnight accepted the halter. He didn't like it, would shake his head irritably and try to rub it off against the fence, but he tolerated Eleanor's hands on his face, her fingers working the buckles. Small victories that felt enormous in the frozen dark. Pemberton's coming tomorrow, Caleb said one night, his breath misting in the cold air. He wants to see the horse under saddle. Eleanor's hand stilled on Midnight's neck. That's too fast. I know, but if I refuse, he'll say I'm stalling, that I haven't made real progress. You haven't. I have. The words came out sharper than intended, and Eleanor immediately regretted them. This wasn't about credit or recognition. She'd made that choice herself. But Caleb's expression shifted, something guilty crossing his face. You're right. I'm sorry. I keep forgetting that when people congratulate me, they're really congratulating you. Don't. Eleanor returned her attention to Midnight, running her hand along his shoulder. I told you the conditions. This was my choice. A choice you shouldn't have had to make. They worked in silence after that. Eleanor guided Midnight through basic movements. Step forward, step back, turn left, turn right. Nothing fancy, just building his confidence that following her directions led to praise, not pain. The horse was smart, picking up patterns quickly, but his trust remained fragile. One wrong move, one harsh word, and he'd retreat back into himself. Like someone else Eleanor knew. What if we showed Pemberton tomorrow? Caleb said suddenly. Not me riding him, you. Absolutely not. Why? You've done all the work. You should... Because the moment I step into that corral, every person in Dry Creek will know exactly what's been happening. Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her heart had started beating faster. And they won't see skill or patience or good horsemanship. They'll see the desperate old maid throwing herself at the young rancher, using his horse as an excuse. Caleb flinched. That's not... People aren't that cruel. Eleanor laughed, a short, bitter sound that startled Midnight into backing up a step. She soothed him automatically before turning to face Caleb. You're 26 years old, handsome, owner of a substantial ranch despite your current difficulties. You have no idea what this town is like for someone like me. Someone like you? Unmarried, aging, female, useful only as long as I stay in my proper place. She gestured at the paddock, at Midnight, at the work she'd been doing in secret. This isn't my place. Teaching children to write their letters, that's my place. Sitting quietly in church, that's my place. Growing old alone in a rented room, that's definitely my place. That's, true, it's true, Mr. Mercer, and I accepted it a long time ago. Eleanor picked up the halter she'd removed earlier. I'll work with him early tomorrow morning before dawn. Get him as ready as I can. But you'll be the one Pemberton sees. I can't ride him, not well enough to... Then don't ride him. Just show control. Walk him on a lead line, demonstrate basic commands. Pemberton wants to see a broken horse, but he'll settle for an obedient one. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Eleanor's expression must have stopped him. Tomorrow before dawn, I'll have coffee ready. I don't need coffee. Maybe I do. He smiled slightly. Watching you work is terrifying. I keep thinking one wrong move and he'll kill you. He won't. How do you know? Eleanor stroked Midnight's nose, feeling the soft warmth of his breath on her palm. Because he and I understand each other. We both know what it's like to be cornered, to have everyone expect you to fail. The difference is, I learned to survive it. I'm teaching him to do the same. She left before Caleb could respond, walking back through the snow toward town. The moon had set, and the darkness felt complete, pressing in from all sides. Her feet knew the path by now, even without light to guide her. Halfway home, she heard footsteps behind her. Eleanor spun, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she didn't carry. A figure emerged from the shadows, and her heart lurched before she recognized Mary Chen's face. "You scared me half to death," Eleanor gasped. "I'm sorry, I saw you leaving town, and I—" Mary trailed off, falling into step beside her. "How's the horse? How did you know about the horse?" "Please. You think I don't notice when you leave your room every night smelling like hay and returning smelling like horse?" Mary pulled her coat tighter. "Besides, Sarah mentioned that Mr. Mercer's stallion has been improving remarkably, and I put two and two together." Eleanor sighed. "Who else knows? Just me, as far as I can tell. Though if I figured it out, others might too." Mary glanced at her. "Why the secrecy? You should be proud of what you're doing." "Pride has nothing to do with it." "Doesn't it?" Mary's voice was gentle but firm. "Eleanor, you're one of the most capable people I know, but you hide it like it's something shameful." "I hide it because every time I've ever stood out, this town has made me pay for it." Eleanor kicked at a patch of snow. "When I first started teaching, I tried to introduce new methods I'd learned in Boston. The school board told me to stick to the traditional curriculum or find employment elsewhere. When I organized a library fundraiser, Martha Henderson complained I was making other women look lazy. When I— She cut herself off. Mary didn't need to hear the full list of Eleanor's failures to fit in. "When you what?" Mary prompted. "Nothing. It doesn't matter." They walked in silence for a moment before Mary spoke again. "My husband thinks Caleb Mercer is going to lose his ranch. Says even if the horse improves, Pemberton will find another excuse to take it. Says men like that always do." "Your husband is probably right. So why are you helping?" Eleanor didn't have a good answer. Or rather, she had too many answers, none of them entirely true. Because she felt sorry for Caleb. Because she wanted to prove herself. Because working with Midnight made her feel alive in a way teaching fractions never would. "Because the horse deserves better," she said finally. "Whatever happens with the ranch, with Pemberton, with all of it, Midnight deserves someone who'll see him as more than a problem to be solved or an asset to be sold." Mary was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Be careful, Eleanor." "Of the horse? He won't hurt me." "Not the horse, the situation." Mary stopped walking, turning to face her. "You're spending time alone with a young unmarried man. People will talk. People always talk." "This is different. This gives them ammunition." Mary's expression was troubled. "I don't want to see you hurt worse than you already have been." Eleanor appreciated the concern. She did. But Mary didn't understand. The talking had already happened, back at the corral when Pemberton had offered her up as a joke. Whatever additional gossip might come couldn't be worse than that public humiliation. "I'll be fine," Eleanor said. "I always am." She wasn't sure either of them believed it. The next morning arrived too quickly. Eleanor had managed perhaps 3 hours of sleep before her body jerked awake, knowing she needed to be at the ranch before first light. She dressed quickly in the dark, her fingers clumsy with cold and nerves. Caleb was waiting by the paddock when she arrived, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the frigid air. He handed her one without comment. "Thank you." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. "What time is Pemberton coming?" 10 o'clock. He said he wanted adequate light to properly observe the animal's temperament. Caleb's imitation of Pemberton's pompous tone was surprisingly accurate. Despite everything, Eleanor smiled. "You have 4 hours then. Let's make them count." They worked quickly, Eleanor running Midnight through every command she'd taught him. The horse responded beautifully, as if he understood the importance of this performance. Forward, back, left, right, stand, walk on. Basic movements, nothing fancy, but executed with a precision that spoke to hours of patient training. "Now you try," Eleanor said, handing the lead rope to Caleb. Midnight's ears flicked back nervously at the change, but he didn't bolt. Caleb moved carefully, mimicking Eleanor's calm confidence without quite achieving it. The horse sensed the difference immediately, his steps becoming more hesitant. "Don't pull on the rope," Eleanor instructed. "Let it stay loose. You're not controlling him, you're communicating with him." "What's the difference?" "Control is about force. Communication is about trust." She watched Caleb adjust his grip. Better. Now ask him to walk forward. Don't yank, just a gentle pressure and a voice command. Walk on, Caleb said, his voice lacking conviction. Midnight didn't move. Say it like you mean it, firm but not angry. Walk on. Better this time, and Midnight took 2 steps forward before stopping again. They practiced for another hour, Caleb slowly improving, Midnight slowly accepting this less skilled handler. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't be perfect, but it might be enough to satisfy Pemberton. At least Eleanor hoped so. I should go, she said as the sky began to lighten. You'll do fine. Just remember everything I taught you. Eleanor, Caleb caught her arm as she turned to leave. Thank you for all of this. I know you didn't have to. You're right. I didn't. Eleanor gently removed her arm from his grip. But I did it anyway. Try not to make me regret it. She hurried back toward town, acutely aware that she was cutting it close. The bakery would be opening soon, and if anyone saw her returning from the direction of Mercer's ranch at this hour, the gossip would spread like wildfire. Eleanor made it to her room with minutes to spare, quickly changing into a clean dress and pinning up her hair. Her hands shook slightly from exhaustion and nerves. She'd done everything she could. Now it was up to Caleb, and Midnight, and luck, which had never been particularly kind to her. She forced herself to eat breakfast, toast and weak tea, then gathered her school materials and headed to the schoolhouse. The children arrived in their usual chaotic rush, tracking in snow and noise and energy. Eleanor shepherded them to their seats, took attendance, began the day's lessons. But her mind was elsewhere, at a ranch on the edge of town, watching a demonstration that would determine more than just property ownership. At 10:30, Thomas Miller burst through the schoolhouse door, his face flushed with excitement. Miss Whitmore, my pa says you should close school early today. Everyone's going to Mercer's ranch to watch the horse demonstration. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Everyone? Well, everyone who matters. Pa closed the store and everything. Thomas bounced on his toes. Can we go? Please? Absolutely not. We have lessons to complete. A chorus of groans rose from the students. Eleanor ignored them, turning back to the blackboard where she'd been working through a grammar exercise. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, making her letters uneven. But Miss Whitmore, Thomas, sit down. The rest of you, copy these sentences and identify the nouns and verbs. She made it through another 20 minutes before Sarah Chen raised her hand. Yes, Sarah? Miss Whitmore, you look pale. Are you sick? I'm fine, Sarah. Thank you for your concern. But she wasn't fine. The thought of half the town watching Caleb work with Midnight, of Pemberton's critical eye noting every flaw, of everything she'd worked for potentially crumbling because she wasn't there to guide the horse through his paces, it made her feel physically ill. Miss Whitmore? Sarah's voice came again, worried now. You should sit down. Eleanor realized she'd been gripping the edge of her desk hard enough to turn her knuckles white. She forced herself to release it, to breathe normally, to not let these children see her fear. I'm fine, she repeated. Let's continue with our lessons. But the morning dragged like it was moving through molasses. Every minute felt like an hour. Eleanor kept glancing at the clock, calculating how long Pemberton's visit should take, wondering if it was already over, if Caleb had succeeded or failed, if Midnight had cooperated or panicked. At noon, when she finally dismissed the children for lunch, Eleanor seriously considered walking to the ranch. Just to see. Just to know. She stayed at her desk instead, her lunch forgotten, staring at the wall and trying not to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. Eleanor? She jerked upright. Mary Chen stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. I thought you might want to know, Mary said quietly. It went well, the demonstration. Caleb showed control of the horse, and Pemberton seemed not satisfied exactly, but less hostile. Relief flooded through Eleanor so powerfully she felt dizzy. Are you certain? I wasn't there myself, but I heard from 3 different people. The horse performed beautifully, they said, like a different animal entirely. Mary stepped into the schoolhouse, lowering her voice. They're all talking about what a talented horseman Caleb Mercer is, how his father would be proud. The words should have hurt. They were Eleanor's accomplishment being credited to someone else, her skill being attributed to a man she'd trained, but instead she felt only tired satisfaction. Good, Eleanor said. That's good. Is it? Mary's tone was sharp. You did the work, Eleanor. You spent 2 weeks in the freezing cold, risking your safety, and now he gets all the credit? That was the agreement. Agreements can be changed. Not this one. Eleanor stood gathering her teaching materials. I'm glad it went well. That's all that matters. Mary looked like she wanted to argue further, but footsteps on the porch interrupted them. Both women turned as the door opened, and Caleb Mercer entered, his face flushed from cold and exertion. I'll leave you two to talk, Mary said quietly, squeezing Eleanor's hand as she passed. After Mary left, an awkward silence filled the schoolhouse. Caleb twisted his hat in his hands, looking younger than his 26 years. I wanted to thank you properly, he said, finally. For everything. Pemberton was impressed. He's agreed to hold off on the forfeiture for another month. Give me time to show continued progress with Midnight. Eleanor noticed the name and felt something warm in her chest. You're calling him Midnight? It seemed right. You've been saying it in your sleep sometimes, when you're working with him. Didn't think you noticed, but... Caleb trailed off. Anyway, yes, Midnight. Another month is good. That gives you time to solidify the training, make sure he's reliable even without me. About that, Caleb moved closer, his expression earnest. I don't want you to stop. Working with him, I mean. Today went well, but I know my limits. Without you, I'll ruin everything you've built. Eleanor shook her head. You won't. You've been watching, learning. You can do this. Maybe, but I don't want to do it alone. Caleb hesitated. Would you consider working with him openly during daylight hours? I could pay you properly, make it an official position, assistant trainer or... No. Why not? You've proven your skill. No one could deny Ushwa. They could, and they would. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. Right now you have Pemberton's conditional approval. You're the talented young horseman following in his father's footsteps. The moment people discover I'm involved, that narrative changes. To what? To the desperate spinster seducing the naive rancher, using her wiles to manipulate her way into his business and his bed. Eleanor's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Within a week, we'd both be ruined. You'd lose the ranch anyway, and I'd lose my teaching position. Caleb stared at her. People wouldn't actually think that, wouldn't they? Eleanor turned from the window. When Pemberton made his joke about us marrying, half the town laughed. They already see me as pathetic, grasping at any opportunity. Working openly with you would only confirm their worst assumptions. But that's not fair. No, it's not. Eleanor managed a tired smile. But fairness has nothing to do with how this town operates. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hat still twisting in his hands. What if we gave them a different narrative? He said, finally. What do you mean? What if... He took a breath. What if we actually did get married? Eleanor's first response was laughter, sharp and involuntary. You can't be serious. Why not? It would solve multiple problems. Pemberton wants me married for stability. You want respect and recognition for your work. If we married, you could work with the horses openly, as my wife. No one could question it. Except that would be insane. Eleanor's laughter died. You're 26 years old. You could marry any woman in this territory. Why would you shackle yourself to someone 16 years older? Because you're the only person who's actually helped me. Because you're skilled and intelligent, and you don't deserve to be mocked by people too stupid to see your worth. Caleb's intensity surprised her, and because I think we could make it work. As a partnership, if nothing else. A partnership. Eleanor tested the word. You mean a marriage of convenience? Is that so terrible? People marry for worse reasons. Money, property, social advancement. Caleb stepped closer. At least we'd be marrying for mutual benefit, with honesty between us. Eleanor wanted to dismiss the idea outright, to tell him he was being ridiculous. But part of her, the part that was tired of rented rooms and pitying looks, and teaching the same lessons year after year, hesitated. You don't love me, she said quietly. No. And you don't love me, but I respect you, and I think you respect me. Isn't that a better foundation than most marriages have? Respect doesn't keep you warm at night. Caleb flushed. I wasn't suggesting. I mean, we could maintain separate rooms. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more. Until you meet some pretty young thing and want an actual wife. Then what happens to our partnership? That won't happen. You can't know that. I can know that I'm not interested in pretty young things who giggle and simper and can't tell a bridle from a halter. Caleb's voice was firm. I need someone who understands the work, someone who can actually help run a ranch, not just decorate it. Eleanor studied him carefully, trying to see past the words to his true intentions. He seemed sincere, but sincerity didn't mean he thought this through, didn't mean he understood what he was really offering. I need time, she said finally, to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. Caleb moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you underestimate yourself. You're not desperate or pathetic or any of the things this town whispers. You're remarkable, and I'd be lucky to have you as a partner. After he left, Eleanor sank into her desk chair, her mind spinning. Marriage to Caleb Mercer. The idea was absurd, practical, terrifying, and strangely tempting all at once. She'd accepted long ago that marriage wasn't in her future. At 39, with no money, no beauty, and no connections, she'd resigned herself to spinsterhood. And she'd made her peace with it, or thought she had. But this offer wasn't about romance or fairy tales. It was about respect, partnership, the chance to do work she actually cared about without hiding in the shadows. It was also about tying herself legally to a man she barely knew, gambling her entire future on his continued goodwill, and exposing herself to even more potential mockery if things went wrong. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, feeling the cold ache in her fingers from too many frozen nights at the paddock. Outside, she could hear children playing in the snow, their voices high and carefree. When had she last felt carefree? She couldn't remember. That evening, Mary found her sitting alone in her room, staring at nothing. I heard, Mary said without preamble, about Caleb's proposal. Eleanor's head snapped up. How could you possibly... Sarah overheard two ranch hands talking at her father's store. They heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. You know how this town is? Mary sat beside her on the bed. Are you considering it? I don't know. Maybe. It's complicated. It's simple, actually. Do you want to marry him or not? Want doesn't enter into it. This would be a business arrangement. Mary made a skeptical sound. You keep telling yourself that. But Eleanor, marriage is never just business. Even when it starts that way, feelings develop, resentments, dependencies. You can't share a life with someone without it getting messy. We wouldn't really be sharing a life, separate rooms, separate spheres, until he changes his mind, until he meets someone he actually desires, until you're trapped in a marriage with a man who regrets choosing you. Mary's voice was gentle but relentless. I don't want to see you hurt like that. Eleanor knew Mary was right. Logically, practically, the smart choice was to refuse, to continue teaching, to maintain her independence, to not risk the crushing humiliation if Caleb eventually realized he'd made a terrible mistake. But logic and practicality had kept her safe for 16 years. And what had it gotten her? A rented room, a teaching position she didn't enjoy, and the certainty that she'd die exactly as she'd lived, alone, overlooked, unmourned. What if I want to risk it? Eleanor said quietly. What if I'm tired of being safe? Mary was silent for a moment. Then she took Eleanor's hand. Then I'll support you. Whatever you decide, but please think about what you're really agreeing to. Eleanor thought about it all night, turning the question over and over until her head ached. By morning, she still didn't have an answer, but she had a plan. She found Caleb at the ranch the next afternoon, working with Midnight in the paddock. The horse responded well to his commands now, though Eleanor could see the slight hesitations that meant he still preferred her handling. Miss Whitmore. Caleb's face lit up when he saw her. I wasn't expecting you. I have conditions, Eleanor said without preamble. If we're going to do this, there need to be clear terms. Caleb's expression grew serious. Of course. Name them. First, I work with the horses openly, not as your assistant, but as an equal partner in the ranch's horse training operation. My name goes on any advertisements, any contracts, any sales. Agreed. Second, I keep my teaching position for now. If this doesn't work out, I need something to fall back on. Yes, agreed. Third, separate bedrooms, as you said, but more than that, separate lives in most respects. I won't pretend to be a doting wife, and you won't expect me to perform that role. Caleb nodded slowly. Anything else? Eleanor took a breath. This was the hard part, the condition that would reveal whether his respect was genuine or just pretty words. If you ever change your mind about this arrangement, you tell me immediately. You don't let it fester. Don't let resentment build. You give me honest warning so I can protect myself. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. You think I'll regret this? I think you're young and you haven't thought through what it means to be married to a woman 16 years your senior. I think eventually you'll want something I can't give you. Like what? Children. A real family. A wife who looks appropriate on your arm at social functions. Eleanor kept her voice steady. I'm not naive, Mr. Mercer. I know what I am and what I'm not. Caleb stepped closer, his expression intent. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who stood up to a violent horse without flinching, who worked for 2 weeks in freezing cold without complaint or recognition, who's smarter than half the men in this town but has to hide it to survive. He paused. I see someone I'd be proud to call my partner. The words landed somewhere soft and vulnerable in Eleanor's chest. She wanted to believe them, wanted to trust that this young man saw something worth valuing, but trust was a luxury she'd learned to live without. Those conditions still stand, she said finally. Accepted. All of them. Caleb held out his hand. Partners? Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand, at the calluses from rope and leather, at the strength in his young fingers. This was her choice, her risk, her chance at something different than the life she'd resigned herself to. She took his hand. Partners. They married on a Thursday afternoon with no witnesses except Mary Chen and her husband, and a circuit judge who'd arrived in Dry Creek that morning, looking half-frozen and wholly uninterested in the particulars of their arrangement. The ceremony took 7 minutes. Eleanor wore her least patched dress. Caleb wore a clean shirt that still smelled faintly of lye soap. Neither of them smiled. You may kiss the bride, the judge said, already reaching for his coat. Caleb looked at Eleanor with something like panic in his eyes. She felt it too. This sudden realization that they'd actually done this thing made it real and legal and binding. But the judge was waiting, and Mary was watching with worried eyes, and backing out now would accomplish nothing except proving everyone right about Eleanor's foolishness. So she stepped forward and tilted her face up, and Caleb leaned down, and their lips met somewhere in the middle. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for Eleanor to register warmth and the scratch of Caleb's barely there beard, and the smell of leather and horse, long enough to feel something unexpected flutter in her chest before she ruthlessly crushed it down. This wasn't that kind of marriage. Couldn't be that kind of marriage. The flutter meant nothing. Congratulations, the judge said without enthusiasm, already halfway out the door. Mary hugged Eleanor tightly while her husband shook Caleb's hand. Be happy, Mary whispered, though her voice suggested she didn't think happiness was likely. Eleanor nodded because she didn't trust herself to speak. Happy. What a strange word. What a foreign concept. Caleb had borrowed Tom Morrison's wagon to transport Eleanor's belongings to the ranch. 3 dresses, a dozen books, her mother's hairbrush, and a small wooden box containing letters from her Boston days that she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Everything she owned fit in 2 crates. 16 years of life in Dry Creek, and this was all she had to show for it. The ride to the ranch passed in silence. Eleanor watched the familiar buildings of town give way to open snow-covered range, and tried not to think about the fact that there was no going back now. She'd given up her room above the bakery, given notice at the school that she'd be finishing the term but not returning next year. Burned every bridge that might have led back to her old life. You're quiet, Caleb said finally. I'm thinking. About? Whether I've just made the biggest mistake of my life. The honesty surprised them both. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. Have you? I don't know yet. Ask me in 6 months. Fair enough, he paused. For what it's worth, I'll do my best to make sure the answer is no. Eleanor didn't respond. Promises were easy. Following through was harder. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, decent construction, with a wide porch that probably looked welcoming in summer but now just looked cold. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful and impersonal on her waist. "I cleaned out the spare bedroom upstairs," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's not much, but there's a good stove and the roof doesn't leak. Much." "I'm sure it's fine." It was fine. More than fine, actually. The room was twice the size of her space above the bakery, with a real bed instead of a narrow cot, and windows that looked out over the paddocks where she could see Midnight pacing restlessly. Someone, Caleb, she assumed, had left wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, dried and brittle from winter but still somehow thoughtful. Eleanor set down her crates and stood in the middle of the room, trying to make it feel real. This was her home now, her bedroom, her marriage. It felt like playing pretend. "Eleanor?" Caleb's voice came from the doorway. "I thought you might want to see the rest of the house, and we should probably talk about logistics, meals and such." Logistics. Such a practical word for such an impractical situation. The house tour took 15 minutes. Kitchen, parlor, dining room, Caleb's bedroom at the opposite end of the hall from hers, a cramped room that served as an office. Everything clean but Spartan, the home of a man who'd been living alone and hadn't seen the point in making it comfortable. "I'm not much of a cook," Caleb admitted when they returned to the kitchen. "Usually just make whatever's simplest, but I can learn, or we could hire someone, or I'll cook." Eleanor moved to the stove, examining it. Newer than the one above the bakery, better maintained. "I'm not good at it, but I'm adequate. We won't starve. I didn't marry you to get a cook. No, you married me to get a horse trainer and satisfy Pemberton's requirements." Eleanor pulled open the cupboards, taking inventory. Beans, flour, coffee, not much else. "Speaking of Pemberton, when is he coming back?" "Week after next. He wants to see continued progress." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "I told him I'd hired an assistant trainer. Didn't mention the marriage yet. Thought we should get used to it ourselves first." Smart. Eleanor had to give him credit for that. The town would find out soon enough. Impossible to keep secrets in a place like Dry Creek. But delaying the gossip gave them time to present a united front. "What do you want me to tell people?" she asked. "When they ask why we married so quickly?" Caleb considered. "The truth? That we're partners in the horse training business, and marriage made the most sense for the arrangement? That will make us sound cold and calculating. Aren't we?" Eleanor met his eyes. "Yes, but people don't like to think of marriage that way. They want romance and passion and all the things we very deliberately don't have." "So we lie? We reframe." Eleanor turned back to the cupboards. "We say we bonded over our shared love of horses, that we discovered we worked well together, that the marriage happened quickly because we're practical people who don't see the point in long engagements. That's still basically the truth. The truth presented in a way that won't make them look at us like we're unnatural." Eleanor pulled down the flour, checking its freshness. "Trust me on this. I've spent 16 years managing how this town perceives me. I know what I'm doing." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That sounds exhausting." "It is." That first dinner as husband and wife was awkward and too quiet, filled with the scrape of forks on plates and long silences neither of them knew how to fill. Eleanor had made a stew that was passable but unexciting. Caleb ate it without complaint, which she supposed counted as a victory. "Tomorrow I want to work with Midnight on saddle acceptance," she said, desperate to fill the silence with something, anything. "He's comfortable with the halter, but actual riding is different. Makes sense. I can help, or I'd rather work alone at first. Get a sense of where he is." Caleb nodded. "Whatever you think is best." More silence. Eleanor pushed vegetables around her plate and wondered if all business marriages started this stilted and strange. "We should probably discuss schedules," Caleb said finally. "I usually work the south fence line in the mornings, check on the cattle. If you're working with Midnight, I can adjust." Whoosh. "No need. Morning is fine for me. I'm used to early hours from teaching." "Right, teaching." Caleb set down his fork. "Are you going to miss it, the schoolhouse?" Eleanor considered lying, but what was the point? "No. I was adequate at it, but I never loved it. It was just what was available to a woman with no other prospects." "And now?" Now I have different prospects. Better ones, maybe? We'll see. After dinner, Eleanor washed dishes while Caleb disappeared to his office to work on account books. The division of space felt necessary and lonely in equal measure. This was what she'd asked for, separate lives, separate spheres, but actually living it was stranger than she'd anticipated. She finished the dishes and climbed the stairs to her room, where she unpacked her meager belongings with methodical precision. Dresses in the wardrobe, books on the shelf, her mother's hairbrush on the dresser beside the dead wildflowers, the box of Boston letters tucked in the back of the wardrobe where she wouldn't have to look at it. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the barn. Caleb, probably, checking on the horses one final time before bed. Eleanor watched his shadow move across the lit rectangle and tried to understand what she was feeling. Relief? Regret? Fear? All of it. None of it. Everything at once. Sleep didn't come easy that first night. Eleanor lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling around her. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Caleb's door close, heard his footsteps, heard the creak of his bed as he lay down. Her husband. That's what he was now, legally and irrevocably. The thought should have meant something, but it just felt hollow. Eleanor stared at the ceiling and waited for morning. The town found out about the marriage within 3 days. Eleanor had known they would. In Dry Creek, secrets lasted about as long as spring snow. She'd prepared herself for the gossip, the speculation, the cruel amusement at watching the desperate spinster finally land a man. What she hadn't prepared for was the anger. "You manipulated him." Martha Henderson stood blocking the aisle at Miller's General Store, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "That poor boy. And you used your position as his hired help to trap him into marriage." Eleanor kept her voice level. "I did no such thing. Caleb proposed to me. Because you made yourself indispensable. Because you wormed your way into his business and then made him think he needed you." Martha's voice carried through the store, drawing attention from the other shoppers. "My Sarah told me you've been sneaking around his ranch for weeks, late at night, alone with him. Scandalous." "I was working with his horse." "Is that what you call it?" Martha's smile was nasty. "We all know what you were really doing, and now that poor boy is stuck with you." Eleanor wanted to point out that that poor boy was 26 years old and perfectly capable of making his own decisions. She wanted to tell Martha to mind her own damn business. She wanted to walk away with her head high and her dignity intact. Instead, she said quietly, "Excuse me, Mrs. Henderson, I need to purchase flour." She pushed past Martha and finished her shopping with burning cheeks and shaking hands. This was what she'd expected, yes, but expecting cruelty and experiencing it were two different things. Outside the store, she found Mary waiting by the wagon. "I heard Martha," Mary said without preamble. "She's a poisonous woman. Don't let her get to you." Too late. Eleanor loaded her purchases into the wagon bed. "She's right, you know, about me trapping him. That's exactly what the town will think." "The town can go to hell." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're talking about. They've talked about me plenty, about my husband, about Sarah." Mary's expression was fierce. "Let them talk. You know the truth, and Caleb knows the truth. That's what matters." Except Caleb's opinion of the truth was starting to waver. Eleanor could see it in the way he'd grown quieter over the past few days, in the way he avoided her eyes at dinner, in the tension that had settled over the house like a fog. 3 nights after Martha's confrontation, he finally said something. "People have been talking." Caleb pushed his half-eaten dinner around his plate. "At the feed store, the bank, everywhere I go." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What are they saying? That you seduced me? That I'm a fool? That you're too old, too plain, too—" He trailed off. "Too desperate?" Eleanor finished. "Yes, I've heard similar sentiments. It's not true. None of it is true." "Isn't it?" Eleanor set down her fork. "I am desperate, Caleb. Desperate enough to marry a man 16 years younger for security and purpose. That's exactly what I did. That's not— We agreed this was a partnership, mutual benefit. We did agree to that. But agreements don't change what people see when they look at us." Eleanor met his eyes. "You're having regrets. I can see it." Caleb flinched. "I'm not. It's just harder than I thought it would be. All the whispers and judgment, and you thought you could handle it, but you can't." Eleanor kept her voice level, even as something cracked inside her chest. "It's fine. I understand." "No, you don't." Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't regret marrying you. I regret that everyone's making you feel like you did something wrong when all you did was accept my proposal. A proposal you made out of desperation." "So what? You accepted out of desperation too. That doesn't make it wrong." Caleb ran his hands through his hair. I wish I knew how to make them stop. The talking." Eleanor stood as well, moving to the window. Outside, early March snow fell in lazy spirals. "You can't make them stop. You can only decide whether their opinions matter more than our agreement." "They don't." "Are you sure? Because right now it feels like you're reconsidering." Caleb crossed the kitchen to stand beside her. "I'm not reconsidering. I'm just adjusting to having a wife, to people's reactions, to all of it." "Take your time," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm patient." But patience was harder than she'd expected. Every day brought new challenges, learning to share space with another person, navigating the rhythms of ranch life, working with Midnight while feeling Caleb's eyes on her and wondering what he was thinking. And through it all, the gossip continued like a steady drumbeat. The older wives pitied Caleb for his poor choice. The younger women called Eleanor calculating. The men made jokes about what must happen, or not happen, in the bedroom of a May-December marriage. Eleanor endured it because she had no choice. She worked with Midnight, who at least didn't judge her for being too old or too desperate. She cooked mediocre dinners and maintained her separate bedroom and tried not to notice the growing distance between herself and her husband. Partnership. That's what they'd agreed to. But partnerships required trust, and trust required time they maybe didn't have. 2 weeks after the wedding, Pemberton returned. Eleanor had worked with Midnight every morning, preparing for this moment. The horse now accepted a saddle, though he still tensed when it first settled on his back. He'd let Caleb ride him around the paddock at a walk, though his ears stayed back and his steps were careful. Progress, but fragile progress that could shatter with one wrong move. Pemberton arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, his expensive coat pristine despite the muddy roads. He brought 2 men with him, investors, Caleb said, potential partners if the horse demonstration went well. Eleanor waited by the paddock while Caleb brought out Midnight. The stallion's eyes found her immediately, and she saw him relax slightly. Good. He trusted her, at least. "Mr. Mercer," Pemberton's voice carried across the yard, "I understand you've made progress with the animal." "Significant progress. He's accepting a saddle now, and I've ridden him several times." Caleb's voice was steady, but Eleanor saw his hands shake slightly as he checked the girth. "Accepting a saddle is one thing. Actually being useful is another." Pemberton gestured to his companions. "Mr. Davis here raises horses in Colorado. Mr. Chen, no relation to your local shopkeepers, I assume, imports stock from California. They're both interested in seeing what this animal can actually do." The way he said "this animal" made Eleanor's jaw clench. Midnight wasn't a thing, wasn't a commodity. He was a living creature with fears and needs and the capacity for trust if someone bothered to earn it. Caleb led Midnight to the center of the paddock. The horse moved willingly enough, but his ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds and movement. Alert. Nervous. "I'll start with basic commands," Caleb said. "Walk, trot, stop, turn." He mounted carefully, and Midnight accepted the weight without bolting. Good sign. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as Caleb settled into the saddle. "Walk on," Caleb said, and Midnight moved forward. The first few circuits of the paddock went smoothly. Midnight responded to leg cues, stopped when asked, turned neatly. Eleanor could see Pemberton's skeptical expression starting to soften. Then one of the investors dropped his walking stick, and it clattered against the fence rail. Midnight exploded. Not a full bolt, not quite, but a sudden violent flinch that sent Caleb lurching in the saddle. He grabbed for the saddle horn, managed to keep his seat, but his tension transmitted straight through to the horse. Midnight felt it and panicked further, crow-hopping twice before Caleb could pull him up. "Easy," Caleb gasped. "Easy, boy." But Midnight was too far gone, too deep in his fear. He fought the bit, backing up rapidly, his head tossing. Caleb sawed on the reins, trying to regain control, and that just made it worse. Eleanor couldn't watch anymore. She vaulted the fence, ignoring Pemberton's startled exclamation, and walked straight toward the panicking horse. "Eleanor, get back," Caleb shouted. She ignored him. Midnight, hey, look at me. The horse's wild eyes found her, and something shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed, became something more manageable. Eleanor kept walking, slow and steady, her voice pitched low and calm. That's it. Nothing's going to hurt you. The loud noise is gone. You're safe. She reached the horse's head and put her hand on his neck, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat under sweat-damp hide. Breathe. Come on. Breathe with me. Gradually, impossibly, Midnight's breathing slowed to match hers. His head lowered. The whites of his eyes disappeared. Eleanor looked up at Caleb, who was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. Dismount. Slowly. He obeyed, sliding from the saddle with careful movements. The moment his weight left Midnight's back, the horse shuddered with relief. Eleanor turned to face Pemberton and his investors, suddenly aware that she'd just shattered her own carefully maintained invisibility. Every eye was on her, and none of those eyes looked friendly. Well, Pemberton said into the silence, this is unexpected. I can explain, Caleb started, but Pemberton cut him off. No need. I think we all understand what's happening here. His smile was cold. Your new wife is the actual trainer. You're just the pretty face taking credit. That's not... Caleb tried again. How much did you pay her? Pemberton addressed Eleanor directly now. Or was marriage itself the payment? Security in exchange for making your husband look competent? The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor wanted to defend herself, to explain the partnership, to make them understand. But what was the point? They'd already decided what they believed. The horse was trained by both of us, she said instead. Caleb has been... Please, we have eyes, Mrs. Mercer. Pemberton's use of her married name sounded mocking. You walked into a situation that had 3 men running for safety, and you calmed that beast in under a minute. That's not beginner's luck. That's skill. One of the investors, Mr. Davis, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Pemberton, does it matter who trained the horse? The animal's clearly improved. It matters because our agreement was with Mr. Mercer, based on his represented skills. If those skills actually belong to his wife, Pemberton trailed off meaningfully. Then the horse is still trained, Eleanor said. Still valuable. Still a worthwhile investment. Perhaps, but the question becomes, who actually owns this skill? Who deserves the credit and the money? Pemberton's gaze moved between Eleanor and Caleb. I don't do business with liars, Mr. Mercer. And you've lied to me about your capabilities. I never lied. I said I could get the horse trained. I did that. By proxy. Using your wife as a puppet to accomplish what you couldn't. Caleb's face flushed. Eleanor is my partner, not my puppet. We work together. The distinction matters. Does it? Pemberton pulled out his pocket watch, consulting it with exaggerated care. Here's what I think, Mr. Mercer. I think you're a mediocre horseman at best who got lucky enough to marry someone with actual talent. I think you've been using her skill to prop up your failing business. And I think our agreement is fundamentally flawed because you're not the asset I thought I was investing in. The words hung in the cold air. Eleanor saw Caleb's hands clench into fists, saw the muscle jump in his jaw. She'd seen him frustrated, seen him worried, but this was different. This was rage. You can insult me all you want, Caleb said, his voice tight. But you will not talk about my wife that way. I'll talk about her however I please. She's the one who interfered in a demonstration she had no business joining. Pemberton turned to his investors. Gentlemen, I think we've seen enough. This operation is clearly not what was represented. Wait. Eleanor stepped forward before she could think better of it. You want to see what the horse can do? Let me show you. Pemberton raised an eyebrow. You? Yes, me. The actual trainer, as you so astutely observed. Eleanor moved to Midnight's side, gathering the reins. Give me 5 minutes. If I can't demonstrate this horse's value, walk away. But if I can... If you can, Pemberton prompted. Eleanor met his eyes. Then you acknowledge that the training was successful, regardless of who did it. And you honor your agreement with Caleb. Eleanor, you don't have to... Caleb started, but she cut him off. Yes, I do. She mounted Midnight in one smooth motion, settling into the saddle like she belonged there, which she did. This at least she knew how to do. Midnight tensed briefly under her weight, then relaxed. He knew her seat, her hands, her voice. With Eleanor riding, he was a different animal entirely. She walked him around the paddock once, letting him settle, then asked for a trot. He gave it without hesitation, his gait smooth and even. She circled, reversed, brought him back to a walk, then to a halt. Every transition was clean. Every command followed immediately. Then, because Pemberton's smug expression was insufferable, Eleanor pushed Midnight into a canter. The horse leaped forward with clear joy, finally allowed to stretch and move at speed. Eleanor rode the motion easily, her body in perfect sync with his rhythm. They circled the paddock twice before she brought him back down to a walk, then halted in front of Pemberton. "Satisfied?" she asked, slightly breathless. One of the investors, Mr. Chen, actually applauded. "That was remarkable, ma'am. Truly remarkable." Pemberton's expression had shifted to something calculating. "You're quite skilled, Mrs. Mercer, wasted on a small ranch like this." "I'm not wasted. I'm exactly where I choose to be." "For now." Pemberton smiled. "But choices change. Circumstances change." He turned to Caleb. "I'll honor our agreement, Mr. Mercer. For now. But I want quarterly demonstrations of continued progress, and I want them from her." He pointed at Eleanor. "Not from you pretending to be something you're not." "That's not—" Caleb's protest died under Pemberton's cold stare. "Those are my terms. Accept them, or I invoke the forfeiture clause immediately." Caleb looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. What choice did they have? "Accepted," Caleb said, the word bitter. After Pemberton and his investors left, Eleanor dismounted and began removing Midnight's tack with methodical precision. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, but she forced them steady. Caleb stood nearby, not speaking, his face unreadable. "You didn't have to defend me," Eleanor said finally. "To Pemberton, when he called me names." "Yes, I did." "Why?" Caleb moved closer, taking the saddle from her hands and setting it on the fence rail. "Because you're my wife. Because what he said was cruel and untrue. Because, He hesitated. "Because watching you ride just now, I realized something." "What?" "That marrying you might be the smartest thing I've ever done." Eleanor's breath caught. "Don't say that. You're just grateful I saved the demonstration." "I'm grateful for that too. But that's not what I meant." Caleb reached out, almost touched her face, then seemed to think better of it. "When you rode Midnight, you looked like you'd finally found the place you fit. Like you weren't performing or hiding or pretending, just being who you actually are." The words hit harder than they should have. Eleanor blinked against sudden moisture in her eyes. "That's foolish. Riding a horse doesn't change who I am. Maybe not, but it shows who you are, and what I see is someone extraordinary." Eleanor turned away, busying herself with hanging up the tack. She couldn't let herself believe him. Couldn't let those words settle in her chest and take root. This was still a business arrangement, still a partnership. Getting confused about that would only lead to pain. But that night, lying in her separate bedroom, listening to the house settle around her, Eleanor found herself thinking about Caleb's expression when he'd said she was extraordinary. Found herself wanting it to be true. Found herself terrified that she was starting to care whether it was. The careful distance Eleanor had maintained began to erode in ways she hadn't anticipated. Small things at first. Caleb started leaving coffee by the stove in the mornings, already hot when she came downstairs. She began mending his worn shirts without being asked, her fingers working the needle while he read through cattle reports in the evenings. They fell into rhythms that felt dangerously close to comfortable. 3 weeks after Pemberton's visit, Eleanor woke to the sound of something wrong. Not loud, just off. A quality to the silence that made her skin prickle with unease. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Caleb already at the kitchen window, his face tight with worry. "Storm coming," he said without turning. "Bad one from the look of it." Eleanor joined him at the window. The sky to the west had gone the color of old bruises, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the shutters. March storms in Wyoming could be vicious. She'd lived through enough of them to know. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need to move the cattle to the lower pasture. Get them near the windbreak before it hits." Caleb was already reaching for his coat. "I'll need help. The hands are off fixing the north fence. Won't make it back in time. Eleanor grabbed her own coat without hesitation. I'll come. You don't have to. I grew up on a farm, Caleb. I know how to herd cattle. She pulled on her boots, the old ones she wore for barn work. Besides, you just said you need help. They rode out together, Caleb on his steady gelding and Eleanor on a mare named Bess, who had the good sense not to spook easily. The cattle were scattered across the eastern pasture, grazing peacefully despite the darkening sky. Getting them moving would take time they probably didn't have. The wind hit them before they'd rounded up half the herd, cold and sharp enough to make Eleanor's eyes water. The cattle sensed the storm now, growing restless and harder to control. One young steer broke from the group and Eleanor had to chase him down, Bess responding to her cues with the kind of trust that only came from consistent work. That's the last of them, Caleb shouted over the wind. Let's move. They drove the herd toward the lower pasture, the cattle moving faster now, their instincts pushing them to find shelter. Eleanor rode the left flank while Caleb took the right, and somewhere in the midst of the work, she forgot to be self-conscious about her abilities. This was just work that needed doing, and she knew how to do it. The first fat raindrops started falling as they got the cattle through the gate. Within minutes, it became a downpour. Eleanor's coat was soaked through almost immediately, the cold seeping into her bones. The barn! Caleb pointed through the rain. We need to secure the horses. They rode hard back toward the ranch, the rain so heavy now that Eleanor could barely see Caleb ahead of her. Lightning cracked across the sky, and Bess shied violently. Eleanor kept her seat, but just barely. The barn doors were swinging in the wind when they arrived, one of them half torn from its hinges. Inside, the horses were in a panic. 3 of them had broken free from their stalls and were wheeling around the barn's interior, wild-eyed and dangerous. And Midnight was screaming, his front hooves striking the stall door hard enough to splinter the wood. Get Bess secured, Eleanor shouted, already dismounting. I'll handle Midnight. Eleanor, wait. But she was already running toward the stallion's stall, her boots slipping in mud and scattered hay. Midnight's eyes were rolling, foam flecking his mouth. He was back in that place of pure terror, every bit of progress they'd made threatening to shatter. Eleanor unlatched the stall door and stepped inside. Are you insane? Caleb yelled. He'll kill you. Maybe. Probably, if she did this wrong. But leaving him in this state would destroy him, undo weeks of careful work, prove that fear would always win in the end. And Eleanor was so damn tired of fear winning. Midnight. She kept her voice low and steady, despite her own racing heart. Hey, it's me. Just me. The stallion reared, hooves flashing dangerously close to her head. Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there in the small space and waited for him to see her. I know you're scared. I know this feels like the end of the world. She took a careful step forward. But it's just rain, just wind, nothing that can actually hurt you. Another crack of lightning, and Midnight lunged toward the corner, trying to escape. His shoulder slammed into Eleanor, knocking her against the stall wall hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. Eleanor! Caleb was at the stall door now, his face white. Get out of there. She wouldn't. Because if she left now, Midnight would believe that terror was the right response. That panic was justified. That trust was a lie people told before they abandoned you. Eleanor pushed away from the wall, ignoring the pain in her ribs, and moved to put herself between Midnight and the corner. She raised one hand slowly, palm out, the universal gesture of peace. Look at me, she said. Come on, look. Midnight's ears swiveled toward her voice. His breathing was ragged, his whole body trembling, but he was listening. That's it. I'm here. I'm not leaving. Eleanor took another step closer. You can be scared. That's allowed, but you don't have to be scared alone. She reached out, moving with aching slowness, and placed her hand on Midnight's neck. His skin was slick with sweat and rain, his heartbeat thundering under her palm. Breathe with me, she whispered. In and out, in and out. Outside, the storm raged. Thunder shook the barn's foundation. Rain hammered the roof like fists. But inside the stall, in the small space between woman and horse, something else was happening. Something quieter, but stronger. Midnight's breathing began to slow. His trembling eased. The whites of his eyes disappeared as he lowered his head, pressing his forehead against Eleanor's shoulder. There you go, she murmured, her own eyes stinging with something that wasn't rain. I've got you. She stood there holding him, this massive, powerful animal who could have killed her in a dozen different ways, and felt him choose trust instead of fear, felt him lean into her strength instead of shattering under his own terror. When she finally looked toward the stall door, Caleb was still there, staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You can come in now, Eleanor said. He's all right. Caleb entered the stall slowly, his movements careful. He stopped a few feet away, watching Eleanor's hand stroke Midnight's neck in long, soothing motions. How did you do that? His voice was rough. I didn't do anything. He did it himself. He just needed someone to stay. You could have been killed. Yes. That doesn't scare you? Eleanor looked down at Midnight, this horse who understood what it meant to be terrified and cornered and expected to perform despite it all. Being killed would be quick. Living without purpose is worse. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, You're bleeding. Eleanor touched her temple and her fingers came away red. She must have hit her head when Midnight knocked her into the wall. It's nothing, just a scratch. Eleanor, we should check on the other horses, make sure they're settled. She gave Midnight one final pat before moving past Caleb toward the stall door. The barn was chaos. The loose horses had calmed somewhat, but they still needed to be caught and secured. The damaged door needed temporary repairs to keep it from tearing completely free. Water was leaking through the roof in 3 places, pooling on the floor. Eleanor and Caleb worked side by side for the next hour, catching horses and checking them for injuries, stuffing rags into the worst leaks, bracing the broken door with boards and rope. The work was hard and cold and necessary, and Eleanor was grateful for it. Grateful for something to do besides think about how Caleb had looked at her in Midnight's stall. By the time they finished, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind steady rain and wind that was merely strong instead of destructive. They stood in the barn doorway, both soaked and exhausted, watching water stream from the eaves. Your head, Caleb said. Let me look at it. I'm fine. Eleanor. He turned her gently to face him, his fingers careful on her chin as he tilted her head to examine the cut. This needs cleaning. Could get infected. It's just, please, let me do this. There was something in his voice that made her stop arguing, something that said this wasn't really about the cut at all. They walked back to the house through the rain, not talking, the silence between them different than it had been before. Changed somehow. In the kitchen, Caleb pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. He brought water, clean cloth, whiskey for disinfecting. This might sting, he warned. I've had worse. The whiskey did sting, sharp and burning, but Eleanor didn't flinch. Caleb's hands were gentle as he cleaned the wound, his face close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the small scar on his left cheekbone, the way his hair curled slightly when it got wet. What you did today, he said quietly, not looking away from his work. In the stall. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen. Probably both. You could have died. You already said that. I know, but I don't think you understand what it would have meant if something had happened to you. His hand stilled on her face. I don't think you understand what you've become to this place, to the horses, to... He cut himself off, and Eleanor's heart was suddenly beating too fast. To what? She prompted. Caleb stepped back, putting distance between them. To the success of this ranch. You're essential to everything we're trying to build here. The words were careful, professional. Exactly what you'd say to a business partner. So why did they feel like a lie? I should change, Eleanor said, standing abruptly. I'm dripping all over your floor. Our floor? What? It's our floor now. Our house. Caleb met her eyes. You don't have to keep saying you're like you're a guest here. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and fled upstairs to her room. She peeled off her wet clothes and stood shivering in her chemise, looking at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. There were bruises forming on her ribs where Midnight had hit her. The cut on her temple had stopped bleeding but looked ugly. Her hair hung in wet tangles down her back. She looked exactly like what she was, a 39-year-old woman who'd spent the day doing work that should have broken her. But she didn't feel broken. She felt alive. That realization carried her through the rest of the week, as the storm damage was repaired and life on the ranch settled back into rhythm. She worked with Midnight daily, building on the trust they'd forged during the storm. The horse was different now, calmer, more confident, willing to try new things because he'd learned that fear didn't have to be the end of the story. Eleanor understood that lesson intimately. The town's opinion of her marriage hadn't improved. If anything, the gossip had gotten worse. She heard whispers about how she'd trapped poor Caleb Mercer, how she was too old to give him children, how the marriage was unnatural and would end badly. She heard it all and kept working, kept training horses, kept proving through action what her words could never convince them of. 2 months after the wedding, a rancher from Laramie showed up asking if Eleanor could work with his mare. The horse had thrown 3 riders and was days away from being put down. Could Mrs. Mercer help? Eleanor looked at Caleb, a question in her eyes. "It's your decision," he said. "You're the trainer." So Eleanor said yes, and spent a week gentling a terrified mare who'd been abused by her previous owner. She taught the horse that hands could be kind, that commands didn't have to come with pain, that trust was possible even after betrayal. When the rancher came to collect his mare, he paid Eleanor directly and asked if she'd be willing to work with other horses. He knew people, he said, people with difficult animals and more money than patience. "I'll think about it," Eleanor said. That night at dinner, Caleb brought it up. "You should do it. Take on other clients. Build a real training business." "What about Pemberton? His quarterly demonstrations?" "We'll manage. Besides, having other clients would show him you're in demand. Might make him think twice about trying to control how we run things." Eleanor pushed food around her plate. It would mean more time away from the ranch. More time working alone. "So? You're good at working alone." "I used to be." The words were out before she could stop them. Caleb's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eleanor set down her own fork, suddenly not hungry. "It means I've gotten used to having a partner, to not doing everything by myself, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a dangerous thing." "Why would it be dangerous?" "Because depending on someone meant they could hurt you. Because trust made you vulnerable. Because every time she caught herself wanting Caleb's opinion or missing his presence when he was out working the fence line, she felt the foundations of their careful arrangement starting to shift. "Never mind," Eleanor said. "I'm just tired." But Caleb reached across the table and caught her hand before she could stand. His palm was warm against hers, calloused from rope work, solid and real. "Eleanor, talk to me." "About what?" "About whatever's making you look like you're trying to figure out how to run away." His thumb moved against her wrist, probably unconsciously. "We're partners. That means we talk about things. We talk about horses, about the ranch, about Pemberton's demands." Eleanor tried to pull her hand back, but Caleb held on. "We don't talk about other things." "What other things?" "Things that would complicate our arrangement." "Maybe I want complications." Eleanor's breath caught. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because you don't mean it. Because this is supposed to be simple. A business partnership, nothing more. Because I'm 16 years older than you, and do you think I care about that?" Caleb stood, still holding her hand, moving around the table to stand in front of her. "Do you honestly think that matters to me?" "It should matter. Any normal person would—" "I'm not any normal person, and neither are you." He was close now, close enough that Eleanor could feel the heat coming off him. "You're the woman who walked into a stall with a panicking horse and talked him down with nothing but your voice. You're the person who works harder than anyone I know and never asks for recognition. You're—" "Stop." Eleanor pulled her hand free, standing abruptly. "Please stop." "Why?" "Because you're going to say something that can't be unsaid. Something that will ruin what we have. What if what we have isn't enough anymore?" The words hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls trembling, felt the fear that had kept her safe for so long starting to crack. "I need to check on Midnight," she said, the excuse flimsy even to her own ears. She fled before Caleb could respond, out into the cool evening air, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, the moment when their partnership became something else, something messier and more dangerous. The barn was quiet except for the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. Eleanor went to Midnight, who nickered softly at her approach. She let herself into his stall and pressed her forehead against his neck, breathing in the familiar smell of horse and hay. "I'm making a mess of this," she whispered. "I had one job. Keep it simple, keep it professional, and I'm ruining it." Midnight blew out a breath, warm against her hair. He didn't have any answers, but his solid presence was comforting anyway. Eleanor didn't know how long she stood there before she heard the barn door creak open. She didn't turn around, but she knew it was Caleb, could feel his presence like a change in air pressure. "I'm sorry," he said from somewhere behind her. "I shouldn't have pushed." "No, you shouldn't have. But I'm not sorry for how I feel." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Caleb, let me finish, please." He moved closer, and Eleanor could hear his footsteps in the hay-strewn aisle. "When I asked you to marry me, I meant it as a business arrangement. I thought we could work together, help each other, and keep everything neat and separate. But somewhere along the way, that changed for me." "It can't change. We agreed. We agreed to a partnership, to honesty." Caleb was right outside the stall now. "So I'm being honest, watching you work, seeing your strength and skill and the way you never give up even when this whole town is against you, it made me realize that I didn't just marry a skilled horse trainer. I married someone I genuinely admire, someone I see—" "Don't say it." Eleanor turned to face him, her hands clenched at her sides. "Don't say something you'll regret when you're 30 and I'm nearly 50. When you realize what you gave up by tying yourself to someone old enough to be— You're not old enough to be my mother. You're 16 years older. That's nothing." "It's everything. In 10 years, I'll be gray and wrinkled while you're still in your prime. People will think you're my son when we go to town together. You'll resent me for— Stop telling me how I'll feel." Caleb's voice rose and Midnight shifted nervously. He immediately lowered his volume. "Sorry, but Eleanor, you don't get to decide my feelings. You don't get to tell me I'll regret this when I know how I feel right now." "And how do you feel right now?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "Grateful? Obligated? Temporarily infatuated with someone who's helping save your ranch?" Caleb opened the stall door and stepped inside, and Eleanor's breath caught at the intensity in his expression. "I feel," he said slowly, deliberately, "like I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Like every conversation we have, every meal we share, every time I watch you work with these horses, I discover something new to respect about you. I feel like this partnership we built is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I want it to be more." "More how?" "More real, more honest, more like an actual marriage instead of a business contract we're both too scared to break." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, but not quite touching. "I want to know what you think about things that don't involve horses or ranch work. I want to make you laugh instead of just watching you be competent and serious all the time. I want—" He cut himself off, frustration clear in his expression. "What?" Eleanor whispered. "I want to stop sleeping in separate rooms and pretending this is just about mutual benefit. I want to stop lying to myself that I only admire your skill and not you." The confession hit Eleanor like a physical thing. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there in Midnight's stall, feeling her entire careful world tilt sideways. "I'm scared," she said finally, the admission costing her. "Of what?" "Of believing you. Of letting myself want this and then losing it when you come to your senses." Eleanor's voice cracked. "I've spent almost 40 years being unwanted, Caleb. I don't know how to trust that someone actually chooses me." Caleb's hand finally made contact, his palm warm against her cheek. "Then let me prove it. Not with words. I know words are easy, but with time, with patience, with showing up every single day and choosing you over and over until you believe it." Eleanor wanted to pull away, to protect herself, to say something cutting that would push him back behind the safe boundaries of their business arrangement. But she was tired, so tired of being strong and careful and alone. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be a real wife." "Good, because I don't really know how to be a real husband." Caleb smiled slightly. "We'll figure it out together, same way we figured out Midnight." "That's a terrible comparison. Midnight tried to kill you several times. And you're trying to kill this conversation by deflecting with humor." His thumb brushed against her cheekbone. "It's not going to work." Eleanor caught his wrist, holding his hand against her face. "This is a mistake. You'll regret it." Maybe, but I'd regret not trying more. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of his palm against her skin, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, wanting desperately to believe that this could actually work. One step at a time, she said finally. We don't rush this. We don't pretend everything's suddenly perfect. We just see what happens. I can do that. Caleb leaned closer. Can I kiss you? Actually kiss you? Not like that awkward thing at the wedding? Eleanor's heart hammered. Yes. This kiss was nothing like their wedding kiss. This was slow and careful and achingly gentle, Caleb's hand cradling her face like she was something precious. Eleanor felt herself melt into it, her own hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. This is still probably a mistake, she murmured. Probably, Caleb agreed, but it's our mistake to make. Eleanor moved her things into Caleb's room 2 nights later, carrying her dresses and books down the hallway, like she was crossing a river she couldn't swim back across. Her hand shook slightly as she hung her clothes in the wardrobe beside his shirts, this simple domestic act feeling more intimate than the kiss they'd shared in the barn. You're sure about this? Caleb asked from the doorway, watching her with that careful intensity he'd developed lately. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Eleanor folded her mother's old shawl and placed it in a drawer. Certainty is overrated. Action matters more. They were awkward at first. Learning to share space meant for one person. Caleb kept apologizing for taking up too much room in the bed. Eleanor couldn't fall asleep without reading, and the lamplight kept him awake. They negotiated bathroom schedules and morning routines like diplomats arranging a peace treaty. But slowly, impossibly, they found a rhythm. Caleb started reading with her before bed, his head propped on one hand while he worked through accounts, and she lost herself in novels. Eleanor discovered she liked waking up to the sound of his breathing, liked the warmth of another body beside hers in the pre-dawn cold. The physical intimacy came even slower, both of them dancing around it until one night Caleb just asked outright, "Can I touch you? I mean, really touch you?" Eleanor had laughed at his awkwardness, then pulled him close and said yes. It wasn't smooth or graceful or anything like the romance novels Mary occasionally lent her. It was fumbling and uncertain and punctuated by nervous laughter when elbows collided or someone's knee ended up in the wrong place. But it was real. And Eleanor discovered that real was infinitely better than perfect. The town noticed the change between them almost immediately. The way Caleb looked at Eleanor now, the way they stood closer together when they came to town for supplies, the way their hands brushed when they thought no one was watching. The gossip shifted from mocking to confused to something uglier. It's unnatural, Eleanor overheard Martha Henderson telling her daughter outside the general store. A woman that age shouldn't be able to, well, it's just wrong. Eleanor kept walking, her head high, but the words stung anyway. Some things never changed, some judgments ran too deep to shift. What did change was how much she let those judgments matter. She had Caleb now, and work she loved, and a home that felt like it actually belonged to her. The whispers couldn't take that away, unless she let them. 3 months after their wedding, the storm that would define everything arrived on a Tuesday evening in late May. The sky had been threatening all day, that particular greenish gray that meant serious weather. Caleb wanted to move the horses into the barn early, but Eleanor was working with a client's gelding and needed another hour. Just one more session, she said. He's so close to breakthrough. I can feel it. Eleanor, 1 hour. I promise. Caleb agreed reluctantly, heading out to secure the cattle while Eleanor worked with the nervous gelding in the north paddock. The horse was improving, learning to trust again after years of rough handling. She wasn't about to abandon that progress just because the weather looked mean. She should have listened to Caleb. The storm hit like a freight train, 0 to catastrophic in under 10 minutes. One moment, Eleanor was walking the gelding through basic commands, and the next the world exploded in wind and lightning and rain so heavy she couldn't see 3 feet in front of her face. The gelding panicked immediately, rearing and tearing the lead rope from her hands. Eleanor lunged for him and missed, watching in horror as he bolted straight toward the damaged section of fence that Caleb's ranch hands had been meaning to repair for weeks. No, stop! Eleanor ran after him, but the horse was already through the broken rails and racing toward the open range. She should have let him go. Should have headed for shelter and waited for the storm to pass. Should have trusted that the gelding would find his way back when he calmed down. But this was a client's horse, and losing him would destroy the training business she'd been building, would prove every skeptic right about her capabilities. So Eleanor ran into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain lashed her face hard enough to sting. Lightning split the sky so close she felt the thunder in her bones. She pushed forward anyway, following the sound of hoofbeats, calling the gelding's name until her voice went hoarse. She found him a quarter-mile from the ranch, trapped in a gully with steep sides, still panicking but no longer running. Eleanor approached carefully, her boots slipping in mud, her clothes plastered to her skin. "Easy, boy. It's all right. You're safe now." The gelding's ears flicked toward her voice. Progress. She took another step closer. That's when she heard it, a sound like the world tearing itself apart. She turned just in time to see the massive cottonwood tree, struck by lightning, beginning its fall directly toward the gully. Eleanor had maybe 2 seconds to make a choice. Run and save herself, leaving the horse to die. Or stay and try to get the animal moving, knowing she might not make it out. She stayed. "Move!" She slapped the gelding's hindquarters hard, driving him up the far side of the gully. The horse scrambled, found purchase, lunged forward. Eleanor followed, her legs burning as she climbed, the sound of falling timber growing louder behind her. They made it out with inches to spare. The tree crashed into the gully exactly where they'd been standing, branches breaking like gunshots, the impact shaking the ground. Eleanor collapsed in the mud, gasping for breath, the gelding standing over her like a protective barrier between her and the storm. She'd done it. They were alive. Then she tried to stand and her left leg buckled, pain shooting through her ankle so fierce she nearly vomited. The gelding nuzzled her shoulder, concerned now instead of panicked. Eleanor grabbed his mane and hauled herself upright, putting all her weight on her right leg. The ranch was a quarter-mile away through a storm that showed no signs of letting up. Her ankle was at minimum badly sprained, possibly broken. She started walking anyway, one hand twisted in the gelding's mane for support, each step sending fresh waves of agony up her leg. The journey back took forever. Eleanor lost track of time, focused only on the next step, then the next, then the next. The gelding walked slowly beside her, matching his pace to hers, this horse who'd been too terrified to trust anyone now steady as a rock in the storm. She was halfway home when she saw a figure running toward her through the rain. Caleb, his face wild with fear and relief. "What the hell were you thinking?" He reached her in seconds, taking in her muddy clothes, her obvious pain, the exhausted horse at her side. "I thought, when you didn't come back, the gelding ran," Eleanor gasped. "Had to get him. Client's horse. Couldn't lose." "I don't give a damn about the client's horse," Caleb's voice cracked. "You could have died." "But I didn't." Eleanor tried to smile and failed. "Got him back. Mission accomplished." "Your leg twisted my ankle. It's fine." "It's not fine. Can barely stand." Caleb moved to her other side, taking her weight. "Can you make it to the barn?" "Have to." They made it together, Caleb half carrying her while Eleanor gripped the gelding's lead rope with white-knuckled determination. By the time they reached the barn, her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and the pain was making her lightheaded. Caleb got the gelding secured, then turned his attention to Eleanor. His hands were shaking as he helped her sit on a hay bale, as he carefully removed her boot, as he examined the swelling. "This needs a doctor. It's just a sprain." "It's more than a sprain, and even if it wasn't—" He stopped, running his hands through his wet hair. "Eleanor, you can't do things like this. You can't risk yourself for a horse that isn't even ours. That horse is my reputation, my business. Everything I've been building means nothing if you're dead." Caleb's shout echoed through the barn, and several horses shifted nervously. He lowered his voice with visible effort. "I know the work matters to you. I know building this training business is important, but you matter more. To me. And you keep acting like your life is less valuable than proving something to people who don't deserve your effort." Eleanor stared at him. "That's not—" "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just doing my job." "Your job isn't worth dying for," says the man who is ready to lose everything rather than admit he needed help. Eleanor's temper flared despite the pain. "You asked me to marry you to save your ranch, Don't act like risking things for work is some foreign concept. That was different. How? Because I didn't have you yet. I didn't know what it would feel like to watch you walk into danger and be completely helpless to stop it. Caleb crouched in front of her, his eyes fierce. I spent the last hour imagining finding you dead in that storm, crushed by a tree, struck by lightning, drowned in a flash flood. Every horrible possibility ran through my head, and I couldn't do anything except search and hope and pray I wasn't too late. The raw emotion in his voice made Eleanor's anger drain away. She reached out and touched his face, feeling the rain still dripping from his hair, the scratch of stubble on his jaw. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't think—" "No, you didn't. You just reacted, like you always do when something needs saving." Caleb caught her hand, pressing it harder against his cheek. "But Eleanor, you can't save everything. Sometimes you have to choose yourself." "I don't know how to do that." "Then learn. For me. For us." He kissed her palm. "Please." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to argue further. Caleb half carried her to the house and settled her on the sofa while he went for the doctor. Her ankle throbbed in time with her heartbeat, the pain making it hard to think clearly. But through the fog, one thought remained sharp. Caleb had been genuinely terrified for her. Not worried about his investment or his training program, but scared of losing her specifically. The distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. The doctor confirmed what Caleb had suspected: a bad sprain, possibly a hairline fracture, definitely requiring several weeks of rest and elevation. No working with horses, no walking any distance, complete bed rest for at least 10 days. Eleanor tried to argue. The doctor, an older man who'd seen his share of stubborn patients, just raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Mercer, you can follow my instructions and heal properly, or you can ignore me and end up with permanent damage that'll affect your work for the rest of your life. Your choice." Put that way, there wasn't really a choice. The forced rest was torture for the first 3 days. Eleanor lay on the sofa with her foot elevated, watching through the window as Caleb worked with Midnight and the other horses. She tried to read, to distract herself, but kept getting pulled back to the window to critique his technique. "You're holding the reins too tight," she called out when Caleb came in for lunch on the 4th day. "I know, I can feel Midnight resisting." He poured water and brought it to her. "But I'm managing. That bay mare needs her hooves trimmed. I was supposed to do it yesterday." "Already done. Tom Morrison's son came by and handled it. And the client's gelding is fine. Eating well, no signs of stress from the storm. I've been working with him like you showed me." Caleb sat on the edge of the sofa, studying her face. "The ranch isn't going to fall apart because you're resting for a few days." Eleanor looked away. "I know that. Do you? Because you're acting like everything will collapse without you. I need to be useful." "You are useful. You've built something here, Eleanor. A real training program that people respect, that doesn't disappear because you take time to heal." He touched her ankle gently, checking the swelling. "Besides, you've been useful to me in ways that have nothing to do with horses." "Like what?" "Like making this house feel like an actual home instead of just a place I sleep. Like giving me someone to talk to about things that matter. Like—" He hesitated. "Like making me believe I could actually be happy instead of just surviving." The word settled into Eleanor's chest, warm and unexpected. "I didn't do that. You did that yourself." "We did it together," Caleb smiled. "Which is kind of the point of marriage, I think. The real kind, not the business arrangement we started with." Over the next week, Eleanor learned to accept help, learned to let Caleb bring her meals and adjust her pillows, and handle the morning training sessions without her hovering and critiquing. Learned to trust that the work would continue even when she wasn't directly controlling it. Mary visited regularly, bringing books and gossip and much-needed female company. "The town's talking about what you did," Mary said during one visit. "Running into that storm to save the horse. Let me guess? They think I'm foolish and reckless." "Some do, but others," Mary smiled, "others are starting to see what I've always known, that you're stronger than any of them gave you credit for. Strength that ended with me on a sofa with a busted ankle. Strength that saved a valuable horse and built a reputation that has clients asking for you by name." Mary poured them both tea. "Did you know there are 3 new inquiries this week? People who heard about the storm, about you refusing to give up, they want someone with that kind of dedication training their animals. Eleanor hadn't known. The information sat strangely in her chest, something close to pride, but tempered by the memory of Caleb's fear. I need to be more careful, she said quietly. Not just for me, but for him, for us. That's growth. Mary squeezed her hand. Learning to balance dedication with self-preservation. It's harder than it sounds. By the time Pemberton arrived for his quarterly demonstration 2 weeks later, Eleanor's ankle had healed enough for her to walk without limping. Not enough for riding, but enough to stand beside the paddock and watch Caleb work. Pemberton brought different investors this time. Older men with calculating eyes who examined everything from the barn's condition to the quality of the horse's feed. Eleanor felt their judgment like a physical weight. Mrs. Mercer. Pemberton acknowledged her with a nod that somehow managed to be both polite and dismissive. I heard about your accident. How unfortunate. I'm recovering well, thank you. Good, good. We'd hate for your husband's business to suffer from your absence. The emphasis on your husband's business was deliberate, a reminder that legally everything here belonged to Caleb. Eleanor bit back her response and focused on the paddock where Caleb was bringing out Midnight. The stallion looked magnificent, coat gleaming, muscles defined, moving with the controlled power of an animal that understood its own strength. Caleb mounted smoothly, and Midnight accepted the weight without hesitation. They moved through the demonstration with precision that made Eleanor's chest tight with pride. Walk, trot, canter, flying lead changes, backing, side passing, everything clean and confident and beautiful. When they finished, one of the investors actually applauded. Remarkable transformation, the man said. I remember this animal 3 months ago, completely unmanageable. What's your secret, Mr. Mercer? Caleb dismounted and stood beside Midnight, one hand on the horse's neck. The secret is my wife. Everything you just saw is her work. Her patience, her skill, her understanding of what this horse needed. Eleanor's breath caught. Pemberton's expression went cold. We've discussed this, Mr. Mercer. Your skills are adequate but limited. I can maintain what Eleanor builds, but I can't create it from nothing. She's the true trainer here, and pretending otherwise is dishonest. Caleb looked directly at Pemberton. If you want to invest in this ranch, you're investing in both of us. That's non-negotiable. The silence stretched. Pemberton's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. Finally, one of the other investors spoke up. Actually, that makes the investment more attractive. A husband-wife training team is unusual, marketable, and if Mrs. Mercer can produce these results consistently, he gestured at Midnight. Well, that's worth quite a bit. She can, Caleb said firmly. We have 3 other client horses here now, all showing similar improvement, and we're getting new inquiries weekly. Pemberton looked between Caleb and Eleanor, his expression calculating. I want to see the client horses. All of them. And I want documentation of your training methods, success rates, client testimonials. You'll have them by end of week, Eleanor said, finding her voice. Along with our proposal for expanding the operation. We'll need additional paddock space, another barn hand, and updated equipment. That's quite ambitious. That's realistic. If you want this investment to grow, we need room to grow with it. Eleanor moved to stand beside Caleb, their shoulders touching. We're not asking for charity. We're offering you a chance to profit from something we're building together. Pemberton studied them for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. It wasn't warm, but it was genuine. You've grown a spine, Mrs. Mercer. I respect that. Provide the documentation and we'll discuss terms. After the investors left, Eleanor and Caleb stood by the paddock in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. You didn't have to do that, Eleanor said finally. Give me credit publicly. Pemberton might have been satisfied with, I'm tired of lying. Caleb turned to face her. I'm tired of pretending this is anything other than a partnership. You've earned recognition, Eleanor. I'm not going to keep stealing it. Sharing credit could have cost you the investment. Then it would have cost me the investment. Some things matter more than money. Eleanor looked at him, this man who'd proposed a business arrangement and somehow become the person she trusted most in the world. When did you get so brave? Right around the time I married someone who walks into storms to save horses and refuses to accept that she's not capable of everything. Caleb pulled her close, careful of her still healing ankle. You taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing things that scare you because they matter. That's a terrible lesson. Look where it got me. Eleanor gestured at her ankle. It got you here. With me. Building something real. He kissed her forehead. I'd say that's worth a sprained ankle. The documentation for Pemberton took 3 days to compile. Client testimonials, training logs, before and after assessments of every horse that had come through their program. Eleanor worked on it methodically, laying out proof of what they'd built with the same care she brought to training. When Pemberton returned to review the materials, he brought a lawyer and a new contract. The terms were better than Eleanor had dared hope. A significant investment in exchange for 20% interest in the training operation, along with first right of refusal on any horses they decided to sell. There's one additional clause, Pemberton said, tapping the final page. Any expansion of the operation requires my approval. I want to ensure my investment is managed responsibly. Eleanor read the clause carefully. It was restrictive but not unreasonable. We can work with that. Excellent. Pemberton stood, offering his hand first to Eleanor, then to Caleb. I look forward to a profitable partnership, all three of us. After he left, Eleanor sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. They'd done it. Secured the investment, saved the ranch, built something sustainable. We should celebrate, Caleb said, but Eleanor shook her head. Later. Right now, I just want to sit here and believe this is real. Caleb sat beside her, taking her hand. It's real. We made it real. The summer that followed was the busiest of Eleanor's life. Word spread about the Mercer training program, and clients arrived from across Wyoming and neighboring territories. Some brought dangerous horses, others brought nervous ones. A few brought animals that had simply been misunderstood by previous handlers. Eleanor worked with each one, building trust methodically, teaching them that humans could be kind and consistent and worthy of faith. Caleb handled the business side, scheduling, billing, managing the ranch hands they'd hired to help with the expanded operation. They worked as a true partnership now, each contributing what they did best, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating victories together. The town's opinion shifted slowly, grudgingly. People stopped whispering about the age difference and started asking Eleanor's advice on difficult animals. Martha Henderson still sniffed disapprovingly whenever they passed, but even she had to admit that the Mercer Ranch was thriving. On their first anniversary, Caleb surprised Eleanor with a gift, a hand-carved sign that read Mercer and Mercer Horse Training, with both their names in equal-sized letters. Thought it was time we made it official, he said, as they hung it at the ranch entrance. You're not my assistant or my helper. You're my partner. Eleanor ran her fingers over the carved wood, feeling something break open in her chest. For so many years, she'd accepted being invisible, being overlooked, being the woman no one chose. And now here she stood with a man who chose her every single day, whose respect for her work matched her respect for his, who made her feel seen in ways she'd stopped believing were possible. I love you, she said, the words emerging naturally, without thought or hesitation. Caleb's expression softened. Took you long enough to say it. I'm slow with some things. That's all right. I'm patient. He pulled her close, kissing her with the kind of tenderness that still made her breath catch. Besides, I've loved you since the night you walked into Midnight's stall during that storm. I can wait for you to catch up. They stood there in the fading light, two people who'd started as strangers making a calculated arrangement and ended up finding something neither of them had been looking for. Love wasn't what they had agreed to. Partnership was supposed to be enough. But somewhere between the business contract and the actual marriage, between the separate bedrooms and the shared bed, between the careful distance and the genuine intimacy, they'd built something that transcended their original agreement. They'd built a life. That evening, Eleanor walked out to Midnight's paddock. The stallion came to her immediately, pressing his nose into her palm, this once violent animal now gentle and trusting. You taught me something, Eleanor told him quietly. You taught me that being broken doesn't mean being unfixable. That trust is possible even after betrayal. That the right person can help you believe in yourself again. Midnight blew out a breath, warm against her hand. I spent so long thinking I was too old, too plain, too unwanted to deserve happiness. just like you spent so long thinking humans only brought pain. Eleanor stroked his neck. But we were both wrong. We just needed someone patient enough to prove it. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Caleb approaching, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed her one and leaned against the fence beside her. Talking to the horses again? They're better listeners than most people. Fair point. Caleb sipped his coffee, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. What were you telling Midnight? That he saved my life. Just not in the way people usually mean. Caleb glanced at her, curious. How so? Eleanor considered how to explain it. How working with this terrified horse had forced her to confront her own fears. How proving she could gentle him had given her the courage to believe she deserved more than the scraps this town offered. How his transformation had mirrored her own. He reminded me that worth isn't about what other people see, she said finally. It's about what you know yourself to be capable of. And that sometimes the things that scare us most are exactly what we need to face. Like marrying a man 16 years younger and letting yourself be vulnerable? Exactly like that. Eleanor smiled. Terrible decision, by the way. Would not recommend. Liar. Complete liar. She turned to him, setting down her coffee so she could take both his hands. Caleb, I need to tell you something. His expression grew serious. What? I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy. And I never thought I'd be able to say that. Eleanor's voice caught. I thought my life was already decided. Teaching until I was too old, dying alone in that rented room, leaving nothing behind except some students who might vaguely remember my name. But you changed that. You saw me when I'd convinced myself I was invisible. You made me believe I deserved to be chosen. Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Eleanor Mercer, you were never invisible. You were just surrounded by people too stupid and short-sighted to see what was right in front of them. I'm just glad I wasn't one of them. You were at first. That day at the corral, you didn't even notice me standing there. I noticed. I just didn't understand what I was seeing yet. He kissed her softly. But I understand now. I see exactly who you are. Strong, skilled, stubborn as hell, and the best thing that ever happened to me. They stood there as darkness fell, 2 people who'd found each other through necessity and stayed through choice. The ranch spread out around them, solid and real and theirs. The horses moved quietly in their paddocks. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Eleanor had spent 39 years being the woman no one chose, the spinster everyone pitied, the capable person everyone overlooked. She'd accepted it as inevitable, had built walls to protect herself from the constant disappointment of being invisible. But standing here with Caleb's arms around her and a business she'd built with her own skill and a future that stretched before them like an open road, Eleanor understood something fundamental. Worth wasn't given by others. It was claimed, fought for, proven through action and persistence and the stubborn refusal to accept that overlooked meant unworthy. She'd been overlooked her entire life, but she'd never been unworthy. The difference between those 2 things, that was everything. Come on, Caleb said, taking her hand. Let's go inside. Early day tomorrow. Always an early day on a ranch. And you wouldn't have it any other way. Eleanor laughed because he was right. This life, hard work and early mornings and difficult horses and a man who saw her truly, was exactly what she wanted. Not what she'd expected, not what she'd planned for, but what she'd found anyway in the frozen winter of a town that had mocked her, with a young man who'd needed help and ended up offering everything. They walked back to the house together, their footsteps matching, their hands linked. Behind them, Midnight watched from his paddock, this horse who'd been broken and healed, who'd learned to trust again, who'd helped teach Eleanor that transformation was possible at any age. Inside the house, Eleanor hung up her coat and saw her reflection in the hallway mirror. Gray starting at her temples, lines around her eyes, the face of a woman who'd lived almost 40 years and carried every one of them, but also the face of a woman who was loved, who'd built something worth keeping, who'd proven that the stories other people told about you didn't have to become the truth you accepted. You all right? Caleb asked from the kitchen. Eleanor touched her reflection, seeing not what she'd been taught to see, too old, too plain, too unwanted, but what she'd fought to become, a skilled trainer, a trusted partner, a woman who'd walked into storms and come out stronger. I'm perfect, she called back, and this time she meant it. Not perfect in the way stories usually ended, with everything smooth and resolved and tied in neat bows, but perfect in the way real lives could be, messy and hard-won and absolutely worth fighting for. Eleanor Whitmore Mercer, the woman Dry Creek had mocked and pitied and overlooked, had become the woman who changed everything. Not through beauty or youth or the conventional paths society prescribed, but through skill and stubbornness and the revolutionary act of believing she deserved more than the scraps she'd been offered. And in the end, that belief, that single, stubborn insistence that worth existed regardless of recognition, had rewritten her entire story. The town would remember her now, but more importantly, she'd remember herself. Not as the spinster who was pitied, but as the woman who refused to accept that version of her life. That refusal, that was where real change began.